Thank you for coming. My name's Tanya Henderson, and you can hear me okay? Okay, good. Just to give you a little bit of background about myself, my background, I'm trained as a lawyer. I'm an international and human rights lawyer. I did actually my law degree here at Suffolk and my master's in international law at the Fletcher School at Tufts. And for the last several years, I've been working actually in the women, peace, and security field. I know that you guys did a screening last night of Pray the Devil Back to Hell, right? How many saw that film, just so I get a sense of room? Okay, great. So that's been the bulk of my work for the past 6 or 7 years. So, and then more recently have moved into actually helping women get elected to parliament that will actually advance women's rights and peace and feminist policy agendas in parliament. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about both today because I think they're both pretty cool. But also, since you spent the time last night watching Pray the Devil Back to Hell, and actually I just flew in last night from The Hague where I was at a women's conference with Lema Gabawi from Pray, as well as, we had about 1,500 other women peacemakers, human rights defenders from 82 different countries, and it was like this extraordinary experience and opportunity. So I was thinking today we could talk a little bit about the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, and then really how that led into the work I'm doing right now, because the two completely informed each other. If you had asked me 2 years ago, would I be working on women in politics right now? I'd be like, no way, I'm totally a grassroots girl. But it was actually from spending pretty much the past 20 years in nonprofit and grassroots that I realized if we didn't have women at decision-making roles and really empowered women policymakers, no matter how much we did the grassroots, we didn't really have the rule of law in place, or we didn't have those. So we had to start connecting the two. So what is the Women, Peace, and Security agenda? Oh, wait, and just backing up before we talk. So I want to make sure we have time for dialogue and question and answers today. So I'm going to definitely not go past 12:40, but aim for 12:35, so we have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for Q&A. Okay. So the Women, Peace, and Security agenda, it's the goal of this agenda. It's an international policy agenda that really focuses on the full and equal participation of women in conflict resolution, conflict prevention, and peace building. And how did this agenda come about? Was in some ways because of the film that you saw last night with Pray the Devil Back to Hell. So really after the fall of the Cold War and the Soviet Union and the breakdown of countries, we started really globally to start to see, move from interstate conflicts into intrastate conflicts, right? So it wasn't no longer, one nation, announcing a war against another nation and two armies fighting each other. You really started to have these intra-state conflicts, over ethnic differences, natural resources differences, or religious, right? And so as a result, that whole nature of warfare changed to the extent that there was a disproportionate impact on civilians, and particularly women and children. And yet, women were largely excluded from any of peace processes, any conversations on how to prevent the conflict, and more, not more significantly, but in some ways the roadmaps to peace building afterwards, right? Because when you're talking about just under cultural and gender stereotypes, women have historically been largely more community-based, right? Largely more involved in food growing and networks, and so they were making peace agreements between essentially the two combatant forces, right? The men with guns, and yet the women weren't part of these peace processes to talk about how to really resolve those conflicts moving forward. So in 2000, the UN Security Council passed a resolution, 1325, which mandated that women had full and equal participation in all peace and conflict decision-making, specifically looking at the protection of women and girls in conflict. I think if you think about, both Rwanda and the Bosnian War, right, you started to really see a shift where rape of women wasn't just like a side effect of war, but it was starting to become a tool of war, right? When you had, rape camps in Bosnia, where the soldiers were actually, raping women repeatedly to essentially, start a new ethnic population, right? They're using women as a tool of war. as a means of genocide in some ways. So there was a strong effort in 1325 about looking at women and girls in conflict, and then starting to have gender mainstreaming, and we'll talk about that, in our UN institutions, in our decision-making bodies. This 1325 was followed by a series of resolutions that came afterwards, and still, even this past year, there was another resolution that actually started to look at how small arms trade, directly connects and links to gender-based violence against women. So it's still a very active agenda. And one of the mandates of 1325 was that every member state, every country, had to have its own implementation plan. So in 10 years later, in 2010, Hillary, when she was Secretary of State, actually really surprised the whole community by announcing that the U.S. would have a national action plan. And that was extraordinary. I don't know how much of you have any idea of how much the U.S. government disregards international agencies in the UN. But we really do. The basis is that no other country or institution should have power over U.S. laws, blah, blah, blah. So the fact that we took lead on this, and Hillary announced that we would have this national action plan. And for my own involvement, it was really an awesome time for me, because I had just graduated Fletcher at that time in 2010 and started working for the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is actually this conference I was at last night. And many of we call them WILF, many of the WILF women had been the first to advocate and actually draft 1325. At the UMass Boston, the Gender Consortium, Carol Cohn runs that consortium, and she was one of the original drafters of 1325. So you had, so I was coming out at this time and had the opportunity to actually start to look at what does security mean for U.S. women, and how do U.S. women have a say in our own U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. So I went around the country and actually held listening sessions, 5 listening sessions around the country, where we had women that had been previously incarcerated, victims of trafficking, domestic violence, as well as ACLU women, academics, and held these listening consultations to really compile data for what should be in the U.S. National Action Plan. And the State Department, actually got the State Department to come and listen to these listening sessions. And we compiled these and had a report in the end. And our U.S. National Action Plan actually reflected that. So that was a really extraordinary opportunity for me in terms of my own work on that. What resulted, and then the NAP, we call it a NAP, a National Action Plan, was introduced by executive order of President Obama in 2011. And it is really quite comprehensive. Not that we're actually implementing it fully, we're not even close to implementing it fully, but it mandates gender mainstreaming, all 5 of these, we call these 5 pillars. So participation in peace processes and decision making, protection of violence, conflict prevention, access to relief and recovery, and then this national integration and institutionalization. So what that meant was that our Department of Defense, our State Department, Department of Justice, Treasury, Homeland and Security actually had to do, and USAID, had to start looking at how all of their own internal mandates, practices, behaviors, attitudes differently impacted women. And so do a gender mainstreaming. And they had to make annual reports on how they're implementing it. They had to create their own national action plans, national implementation plans. That was USAID, Department of Defense, and State Department that had to do that. So USAID has been doing a fantastic job on that. State Department and DOD, they really still don't know what gender mainstreaming is, but we're working on it. It'll probably be a long way, but so this is what kind of came out of that. And the reason I like to highlight this is a lot of times I don't think that people give credit to what this actually did for our U.S. government. I mean, and it hasn't, because it's not been fully implemented yet. But when you think about the fact that security, from the U.S. perspective, has, for a very long time been very militarized security. This is how our viewpoint, right? Security is, do we have armies? Do we have guns? Do we have nuclear weapons? How are we intervening in conflicts? The role that we're playing as kind of the police of the world. But this started to introduce a concept of security that was based on, so the access to relief and recovery pillar includes access to education, food security, human security, protection of violence, starting to look at gender-based violence and how that has to be addressed in conflict, right? So it's actually quite transformative. It'll be a while, like I said, before I think that we can, if we continue to push for it and advocate for it, if you continue to speak up and speak out, then I really think that it introduces a concept into this our foreign policy agenda that really hadn't been there at all before and had been an afterthought. So that's kind of the 1325. And then following that, you can't really see this so well, once we got the National Action Plan in place and by executive order, then I actually left that job to go work for another organization that worked on U.S. policy because I wanted to make sure that we codified this National Action Plan. It's by executive order right now. So I worked on with the Civil Society Working Group on Women, Peace, and Security in D.C., as well as Senator Boxer's office and in the Senate and Congresswoman Jen Schakowsky to draft a Women, Peace, and Security Act. And this is essentially, well, I don't know how well you can read it, but again, think about this. We have a law that says to ensure that the United States promotes women's meaningful inclusion and participation in mediation, negotiation processes, to mitigate and resolve conflict. And this has been introduced in the Senate and the House since 2012. It was just recently again introduced, what month are we on? I think in January by Senator Boxer. So it's an ongoing advocacy effort and something that the people that are committed to it really understand that this isn't, women's issues in conflict, women's issues in security can no longer be an afterthought. However, that said, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Geneva II peace processes that came out of Syria, the Syrian conflict this past year. So we had globally, we had a really active movement to push for women's participation in that peace process, and actually held a parallel peace conference during the Geneva II. We brought in, there was about 100 Syrian women that came in, really prepared with a map, a roadmap to peace in Syria following that. Brought in women from Rwanda, Liberia, women that had actually been engaged in resolving violent conflict. And not a single woman was invited from this parallel peace process. You had like 300 women, 100 feet from the Geneva II, and not a single woman was invited over to the peace process in Geneva. So we still have a long way to go there. So I guess then that leads me to how did I move from that really hardcore advocacy on women in conflict to helping women get elected to parliament globally. And I think again, we have these journeys, right, in our careers and our stories, and find that something happens to us that wakes us up to a new mission. And I'd always thought that I would start my own NGO. And people thought that I would. But when they would ask, why, what are you going to do, I realized I hadn't found one thing that I really felt like I could have a measurable impact on until I met Shinkai and some other really, really fantastic women parliamentarians. So part of that last work I did when I was working on getting the Women, Peace, and Security Act introduced in Congress, I had I'd been tasked with this really, really cool job to bring together women parliamentarians from Afghanistan, Pakistan, the MENA region, and the U.S. to start to create a global advocacy coalition on the role of women in preventing and resolving conflict and peace building. So they were to come together as women political leaders and create kind of a collective advocacy agenda, both internationally, and then that they would then bring back into their own countries to implement. And so I worked with these women for about a year and a half, and one of them, Shinkai Carol Call, is a parliamentarian in Afghanistan. She's been an MP there since 2005. So when you think the U.S. came in 2001, really got rid of the Taliban in 2002, this is just 3 years after that, right? So Shinkai was telling this story one day about when she had, it was about 2009, and a law had been introduced, a draft bill had been introduced in the Afghan parliament. It was a Shiite personal status law. So what that means, personal status laws essentially mean anything to do with women, children, family, inheritance, divorce, domestic violence. A lot of countries, although they'll have constitutional laws around general human rights or women's rights, when it comes to these personal status laws, they consider them private family matters, right, or private religious matters. And so I actually call them opt-out options because in these countries where they exist, you can opt out of following the constitutional, human rights protections and go to a religious court. So there had been a law that had been introduced for Shiite women that essentially would have completely rolled back all Shiite women's rights in Afghanistan. And the Shiite make about 30% of Afghanistan, but the majority of leadership in Kabul, political leadership in Kabul, are Sunni. So it came in, and people didn't really think it affected them. They didn't really care, and it just got passed. And she was the only parliamentarian to speak up and to oppose it. That said, putting this in context, Afghanistan has a 25% women's political quota. So there's 64 women in parliament. So it's not that she was the only woman. She was the only person to oppose it, right? So then once it passed, because she was the only one person to oppose it, she very smartly and strategically reached out to international media. And she said, I'm going to give you an exclusive interview. And she's kind of an international spokesperson. I'm going to give you an exclusive interview if you promise not to release it until 6 a.m. on this specific day. And the interviewer was like, okay, great, fine, I get an exclusive interview. She had timed it so that that day that it would be released, it would be the first thing on the BlackBerries that all kind of international aid donors would see the morning they walked in to meet with Karzai to talk about funding post-2014 troop withdrawal. So the funders, Netherlands, U.S., Japan went in and said, our aid is tied directly to gender equality. You have to send this to Karzai. You have to send this law back to Parliament. And by the time they sent it back, she had already prepared 50 amendments to this draft law that completely reinstated women's rights. And she personally introduced, and it got passed. And so single-handedly, like one woman, right? 30% of the women in Afghanistan, she's single-handed, and she's not Shiite. She's very Sunni. So after I heard that story, I was like, that's what we really need. We really need more women like Shinkai. So I sat down with her and her sister and some of the other MPs, and I said, why? Why don't we have? You've got 64 women in Afghan parliament. Why don't we have more women like you? And so, we started looking at the barriers. And, to women's political participation. And, of course, money is a big one. The quotas that were happening, and it's kind of, and even more recently in the past year, if you're following this issue at all, you hear, Yemen has a 30% women's political quota now, right? Many of the countries that are rebuilding their government are instituting these political quotas. And yet, they're also being introduced in countries where, in 2002, Afghanistan had 83% women illiteracy rate, okay? So, how do women don't have the capacity, the skills, right? And then what was happening is that the men, the warlords, the mayors, were essentially putting in their wife, sister, daughter as really a token. And so Afghanistan actually had a number of women in their parliament that were illiterate, couldn't read or write, and were being told how to vote, by their husbands. And that's not a unique case. You hear it in countries. It's just the reality, when women don't have the access to resources. So I came up with the idea with Shinkai and some of our colleagues about an organization that would actually provide the resources to help women that were empowered women get elected to parliament, essentially whatever they needed to empower them. So Mina's List is my nonprofit, and its goal is to achieve 50% and substantive political representation in national governments worldwide. And that substantive piece is really important, but I'm going to talk about that in a slide moving forward. Oops. So why is that important? We might be 50%, but globally only 1 in 5 parliamentarians is female. I don't know, we hear these statistics so often that we tend to think, oh, well, that's 20%, it's not so bad. But when you look at that pie and you think that's how imbalanced our decision-making is globally, right? And then in 37 countries, women account for less than 10%. What actually does 10% look like? This was another one, because you think, okay, well, these countries where women have been really marginalized, at least there's 10%. But then when you look at the numbers, you look at Bahrain, right? So you have 4 women out of 40 members of parliament. Mali, 14 women out of 147. And Sri Lanka, 13 women out of 225. And then you put that into context and you think, okay, you're in a country where maybe women's voices have been traditionally marginalized, and now you're in a decision-making body where it's majority of men, and you're just a handful of women. How, even if you had really strong intentions, even if you were smart, educated, courageous, right? Like, how do you even mobilize? There's not enough of you to even mobilize, right? So, so this is why this number of equal participation is so important, at least to get enough women's voices there at the table so that they can, be strong enough to make an impact. The substantive representation, though, is really key, and that goes back to Shinkai's story of why you have 1 out of 64 women that oppose this law. Right, so substantive representation means that women's interests will be advocated in the political arena, and that women leaders are actually willing and able. And I think the willing and able is really important because, you might have somebody that, like I said, really wants to, but either her political party, which, we see this in the U.S. all the time, right? You might have a woman politician that, kind of goes in on a woman's agenda, but her political party totally supersedes, right, the women's agenda. Or she, maybe she's tied to her only monetary resources for funding her campaign are coming from people that don't want her to move a woman's agenda. And then the willing, the willing's another piece. It's a reality. Women are human beings, right? You don't necessarily, every woman isn't committed to a feminist agenda, right? So that's just life. It's no shame, but we need women that are going to represent women's interests. So what's a woman's agenda? Let's see, where are we on time? I'll just kind of look up this a little bit. I like to always reflect on how gender plays out because I'll tell a story about this. So we had a launch of Mina's List in Boston in December, and Mayor Ray Flynn came. I don't know if many of you know him, but he was the ambassador to the Vatican under the Clinton administration. And when he and I were talking before the event, and he says, "Well, Tanya, are you sure you want me to come? You know I'm pro-life, right?" And I said, Ambassador Flynn, and that said, he also was. He's known as one of the first to call out the Rwandan conflict an actual genocide. Right, and he's really known for working on for economic and developmental rights. And so maybe he and my politics didn't necessarily align, yet what constitutes a women agenda, I think, is really unique to the culture of the community that they're working on. Access to health care and food security might be a priority at that moment in time in that country. So Mina's List doesn't define what a woman's agenda is. Gender, is country, culture, time-specific. Bottom line, though, across the board, gender is about power relationships. So for me, are the women actually empowered to advance the issues that reflect and represent the women of their community, right? So it's that, evening the power tables. And then a feminist political agenda. Margot Wallström, she's foreign policy minister for Sweden, right? Yes, Sweden. Yes, okay. So she recently created quite a stir. Do many of you know about what she did? Yeah, you do? Okay, go ahead, you can share.
She said that, every country should have a feminist foreign policy. It's the only way to prevent war.
Yeah. And actually, she took it even further because she called out Saudi Arabia for their human rights violations and their violations of gendered women's rights, and canceled a 10-year-long defense contract with Saudi Arabia. and created, I mean, clearly quite a buzz in the Middle Eastern community, but also actually internally in Sweden, because that Sweden I think produces 13. I'm going to get my facts wrong. A large part of Sweden's GDP is based on weapons manufacturing and weapons sales, right? So this canceling of these defense contracts, but it was also the business people internally, H&M, a lot of these businesses inside were like, you just cut us off, from sales, right? In these, huge markets. That to me, very, very courageous, and yet she made no apologies for it. She said, how can we continue to, really as a country say that human rights are important to us, and yet we, continue to do business with these, with countries that so violate. So you can look her up. There's been so much cool writing about her. If you are really interested, Democracy Now! Did a fantastic article on it with Madeline Reese. So. But just looking why it's necessary, why do we have to speak up and stand up for women's equal and substantive political participation? I don't know if you can see this quote, but it's by Groucho Marx, and this quote I think is like the best ever because it really shows that gender is a power relationship, right? I'd give up my seat for you if it wasn't for the fact that I'm sitting in it myself, right? Like, people don't give up power generally, willingly. And then how this plays out globally for women is that, UN put out a resolution on women's political participation in 2011 that talked about that essentially women across the world, were marginalized in the political sphere for discriminatory laws, gender stereotypes, but also access to education, healthcare, and the disproportionate effect of poverty on women. And then getting into just some real specifics. This is a list of, kind of, again, across the board of limitations to women's political participation. I think some of the things are pretty obvious, but time doesn't always get recognized. When you think, again, about our gender roles in society, where, culturally still women largely do most of the caregiving, housework, also maybe doing a job, now what time is left for them to actually, also take on civic participation, political participation. So time ends up being a real constraint. And then our political systems have been really created around male cultures, right? So a lot of the political meetings are at night, maybe when women are at home, taking care of the children. And so the whole structure, in many ways, just excludes women because it hasn't been created with the perspective of women in mind. Political violence is really a pressing issue right now, and I don't think it gets the attention it does. And it probably doesn't get the attention it does is because of the role of the media. I can't tell you. I mean, again, Shinkai has given me so many examples about when they were, introducing the violence against women's law in Afghanistan, in her own constituency, didn't even know anything about it because the media just does not create a platform, right, for women. But when women are politically represented, and empowered, what does that look like? So, in Argentina, despite representing 14% of deputies, female MPs introduced 78% of the bills related to women's rights. Morocco is a phenomenal example because Morocco, women tend to be more educationally and economically empowered there. But they introduced a political quota first in 2002, but the big one was in 2011. Actually, so the 2002 political quota, the women that got in there said we need to do a complete overhaul of all of our electoral processes and our laws and our gender mainstreaming, which then led to the 2011 quota where there was a substantial, I think it's 30% of their parliament are women. They even have a youth quota, which I think is very cool. But from the time, you track, I have one of Lubna Amhar, she's on my advisory board. She's a Moroccan MP. And she said from 2011 to tracking to 2013, the laws that were introduced and passed in the Moroccan parliament completely reformed women's rights. I mean, so fundamentally substantial. Everything from the bottom of the, barrel where It abolished the law of shame, which allowed rapists to marry their victim to escape prosecution, but also sexual harassment laws in the workplace, which, you know, here in the U.S., I mean, I don't think it was until like maybe late 80s, right, that we you know, that got instituted here. So, it was, you know, women's rights to inheritance, economic, you know, job security. I mean, it was just, it's sweeping, and you can track it from the time this 2011 quota was introduced. And then, you know, again, the statistics just show that doesn't matter which country it is, you know, the culture, the context, that an increase in number of women lawmakers directly relates to legislation transforming women's rights. And the other key piece, which I think, you know, maybe isn't always intuitive. I mean, maybe it's intuitive for us, but for the general public, is that statistics also show that when you have more women political leaders in power, you know, health standards, higher standards of living across the board get increased. Everything from infrastructure, health, water, development. Education. And then the nature of governance. So the World Bank did a survey of over 100 countries and showed a direct correlation between an increase in women's political participation to a decrease in corruption. I mean, it's like number for number. And then South Africa, women leaders really were you know, critical to creating when they introduced the new constitution after Mandela and the end of apartheid. Women leaders in South Africa, you know, again, looked at a national security framework from the perspective of human security. So access to food security, health care, education. And they also crossed tribes and ethnic groups to do that. I'm just going to speed up a little bit now so we have some time for Q&As. This is really what, you know, I think has enabled us to realize that the time is now. What we're doing right now with Mina's List is so critical. So a 2013 report by the Interparliamentary Union showed that the current increase in the global average of women members of parliament could lead to gender parity, so 50-50 in 20 years if fully capitalized upon. So that's, you know, that's really what we're trying to do. And how do we do that? We partner with in-country women's rights organizations, and we help and we ask them to identify, well, two things. So we partner with in-country women's rights organizations, and then we also recruit current women legislators that are successfully advancing a women's rights agenda. And then we ask the women's rights organizations to find women within their grassroots community that they really think could be strong political leaders. And then collectively identify what are the unique barriers to that community, to that, you know, ethnic group, that religious group, and create training modules that will meet the needs, empower them educationally, resource-wise. We have a mentorship program, so the current women MPs will actually agree to mentor those aspiring women political leaders. And then once they decide to run, we also actually have a C4, which is a non-tax exempt organization that has a crowd-rising profile for the women organizations to raise money for the women candidates that they support and really do social media blast. Mina's List provides all the resources they need both to crowdsource that and to push out social media. And these are our partners. Our current pilot program is in Afghanistan this year. So actually, next month, first week in June, we'll meet with current women parliamentarians in Afghanistan and our two partner organizations. This organization, IWAC, is amazing. They do such tough work. They're like way out in the regions, and they actually provide like defense lawyers for women that are imprisoned for adultery with children. I mean, they do like the really, really hard stuff. And then the Afghan Women's Network, which is probably the most known if you've followed this issue at all. There's Hillary. Anytime you see Afghan women in kind of high profile, they're generally from the Afghan Women's Network. So that's what we're doing. That's how we're speaking up and standing out on women's political participation. And we have just about 20 minutes for questions and answers now. So thank you all so much. Yeah. Yeah. So please, I open the floor. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, I know. It's fascinating, right?
And how did they get that way?
Uh-huh. Oh, great question. Okay. Okay. So, so probably the only good thing that comes out of conflict is that systems and structures are broken down. Traditional systems and structures are broken down. So it actually really provides an entryway for women to be able to get in. So Rwanda, after the genocide and the civil war, many of the men had been killed during the genocide, and so the women had to stand up and take power and take lead. One of our board members, Justine Mumbazi, she's Rwandan. She lost her whole family in the genocide, and then went on to both draft and implement the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and then the Rwandan Constitution. So you had women across the board there really having to had to rebuild their countries and their governments. So that's a unique case. However, that said, I mean, there has been a male president in Rwanda. We're now talking almost 20 years since the conflict, and women now hold 63.8%, in parliament. So they've been able to, the systems that they set up at that time to really provide women access and the resources to step in to those decision-making roles clearly has served them and continue to work. I don't know as much about Andorra. I'll look into that. But Cuba, communist countries actually tend to have better, gender equality. Sweden, your Netherlands. African countries across the board have really strong rates and lower rates. But yeah, so it kind of gives an idea. Any other questions around that? Did I answer the question? Yeah. Yeah. What's that? U.S. 20.9%. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Something else? Yes.
You talked about women's participation in national government.
Uh-huh.
Do you or anybody involved in women's participation in local government?
Provincial level, yeah. It's critical. Provincial level is actually the pipeline, and in some ways it's easiest for women to step into in ways that they can actually have, in some ways, significant impact, right? I didn't do it because Mina's List is global, and I don't have the capacity at this point to go beyond kind of women that don't speak English yet. I mean, this sounds ridiculous, but it's just me and Devin right now. So at some point, I think that we probably will look at provincial. But there are a lot of organizations that do work at kind of a grassroots, ground level. And the other thing that I do feel as well is that once you're creating space in the national government, there's an impetus, right, to create that pipeline, to actually have women that want to step into higher leadership roles. But yeah, it's not the best answer, sorry. Yeah. No. Yes?
You talked about the U.S. National Action Plan, I think.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I wasn't quite sure if that was more of a foreign policy or domestic policy.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, we did. Okay, so it's a really good question. Okay, so it is foreign. It's totally an external-looking policy, very typical of the U.S. government. However, when I was working for WILF and the consultations we were doing, the reason we were doing them internally in the U.S. is because our primary lobbying point was it needed to be internally applied. Probably immigration and homeland security is the only place that that it has any real internal application, and even there, it's not strong. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
So since you founded Mina's List, what does your day-to-day look like, and how does it fit?
You want to answer that, Devin?
Well, there really isn't a day-to-day. So one day it might be focused completely on reaching out to a specific donor and developing a relationship with them. Another day it could be heading up a social media campaign to push Mina's List out into the world. It really varies.
Curriculum writing. Yeah, we do everything, and yeah. So it's really exciting because every day is something new and different, and it's very daunting sometimes. But what's been so incredibly exciting for me is that people really get it. And I guess I didn't realize that just tells me how much our society was ready for this. That this is the time, because I literally, I was this conference I was at this past week. Almost everybody I talked to that heard about Mina's List, they were like, "When can you come to my country? We so need Mina's List." And donors too. I've gotten like extraordinary support. They get it, yeah.
Your work in, your previous work and your work now, these, countries that are maybe developing, do you see that there's a pushback for countries that are actually doing quite well, like maybe countries in the West or Northern Europe, where, you get to a certain point where they say, okay, women have had enough, and then the progress really slows down. I feel like that's something that really is kind of
Yeah, no, I think if you spoke to women that are working on women's issues and women's agenda even like in the Nordic countries where, they're leading the whole world, there's still, but rape is still existent, gender-based violence, there's still the same problems. The women there will tell you that is the response. We haven't experienced that yet, but one of the countries that I'm really hoping that we can do something in the near future is actually Japan, because I think it's such otherwise intense a first world country, economic prosperity, all intents and purposes women should be really empowered, right? And they're so excluded from decision making and in public roles. So that's one place that it'll be interesting to see what kind of response we get. And then actually I got a follow-up question to that recently, and they said, oh, do you think you're going to have problems getting donors to support, work in Japan? And I said, I don't think so, because people get it. So like our next kind of handful of target countries that we're looking at right now is, so Lebanon. Lebanon is another country in the Middle East. It's known as an educational, economic, really the leader, women, have been empowered there in all these other spheres of society. And yet women are 2% of Lebanese parliament, and there's not a single woman in the executive level of government there. So, why is there that gap, right? Colombia is another country because of they're at the point right now where they're about to sign the peace process, and women have largely led, that movement and been very, very active. So you have this strong, mobilized grassroots. So that's another country we're kind of looking at, Japan. So to kind of really show a broad perspective that this issue isn't. I get so angry when everybody's like, oh, the poor women in the Middle East. It's like, I'm telling you, some of these women are like so fierce. This past week, we had so it was one of the panel had one of the leading women of the Libyan revolution, one of the leading women of the Yemen revolution. We had women there from Iraq, Egypt, and these women were very, very, very empowered. It was not, the poor woman. So part of then kind of the educational purpose I want Mina's List. And look at, in the U.S., we have 20%, right? It's shameful. So, yeah. Yes?
Is there any kind of peer pressure among countries where if your trading partner gets more equitable representation, that puts any pressure on you, or is it completely culture dependent?
I don't think I understand.
When you said
Is there peer pressure on me or peer pressure on the country itself?
on the country itself.
By the other countries? Yeah. And so that's why I think there's been this whole wave of quotas, which I'm personally very much in support of quotas. I think you got to get in the door, to start to make some changes. But that said, really, like in the last year, I think Yemen introduced a quota. I think Bahrain did. Saudi Arabia did. Libya did. Right. So there's it's awesome that these are being introduced. But again, if women don't have the resources and the capacity and the education and the tools to actually go in and be empowered women leaders in those roles, then in some ways it actually it looks bad, right? Because then the men leaders say, oh, see, we put all these women in and they didn't do anything. They made bad decisions. They didn't take advantage of these opportunities. We're not going to make such an effort next time around. Or like I said, the women just become tokens. So the quotas are awesome, but they need to be supported with the training, the capacity, the educational building. So like the trainings that Mina's List do, we have three sections that we kind of cover in our trainings. We have governance, so kind of parliamentary structures. How do you get on, the Foreign Relations Committee or the, Finance Committee or like, roles within the governmental structures where you actually can have some power and make a difference. So governance, and then just really like how do you vote? What happens in the day-to-day life of a parliamentarian. We have a whole women's rights section, so we go through both international women's rights treaties, we look at their own constitution, we pull out where there's women's rights laws in them and really make sure they're fully educated on women's rights in their own country. And then campaign tools, how do you fundraise? How do you, talk to your constituency? We have, even intergender communication. How do you talk to men about women's rights as opposed to talking to women about women's rights? So it's really comprehensive in order so that once they're there, they can be effective leaders. Yeah. Yeah.
What role do gender allies have in your organization, and if and how you can leverage men allies?
Wait, can you say that again?
I'm wondering what role gender allies have in your organization, and then maybe you can speak to how you can leverage men allies.
Yeah, that's a really great question. So we do have a man on our advisory board, and he's fantastic. He's actually a young Afghan millennial, as he calls himself. And in Mina's List, there's others that we're reaching out to too. So I feel like you have to, right? Because they're the other 50% of the population, So we have to engage men and boys, in this process. And the women parliamentarians will also tell you that, like the Afghan women will say, when we first started, if we didn't have male allies in parliament, we actually wouldn't have accomplished anything. We were not going to get, the Violence Against Women's Act passed or, our own national action plan, because even if all of the women in parliament were mobilized and were advancing a women's rights agenda, we're still only 25%, right? So you have to have male allies, yeah. And how are we engaging them? I'm not sure yet. We'll see. Yeah, it's our intention.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
So as individuals in the MIT community, how can we get involved? How can we help?
Yeah, thank you. Well, you can help us with social media right now because we're really trying to, get the name out, the word out. We post at least a weekly blog. We're really active on Facebook and Twitter. So that's huge. And I'm open. Like, our day-to-day life, changes every day. So if you have a great idea, I think that would be great. We do have an internship program as well. Yeah, I think that however you want. Of course, at this point, we're trying to get Mina's List off the ground. So, if you're from another country where you know that you have real strong connections to the women's rights community in there, and you wanted to reach out and say, hey, have you thought about doing a program in this country? We have to build those relationships. We won't go into a country if we don't have strong in-country partners. The other thing that I feel very strongly about, having been in the grassroots, is there often is this disconnect between the grassroots community and the women leaders, and as a result, then there's no accountability, right? So when we do our trainings, we're actually not just training the new aspired women political leaders. Throughout the whole process, representatives from the partner organizations and the current women MPs are getting all the same trainings so that when they're back in country, they can continue to reinforce. And so the partner organizations actually also get trainings on how to hold, monitor and hold their elected leaders accountable. And the women leaders know that they're getting that training, right? So they're starting to really close these gaps and what I'm calling, really build kind of a women's rights constituency, where a women's rights political agenda, is as important, if not more, than your own party agenda, or, and that's why I guess the money is important, right? All these other ways that kind of the other, institutionalized power structures are superseding women's rights. How do we address those as well? So I guess that could be another way. But yeah, but definitely like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, push us out. Yeah. Yes.
You talked about gender mainstreaming.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I don't think any of us have really figured it out. Generally, and it's become, and the worst part is, so actually I did my master's thesis on what is gender in the international community, because it's used across the board, and gender mainstreaming is like such a UN, an international term, and again, I don't know if anybody really knows what it is. But at the end of the day, if you look at your own, you look at your own department, or your own project that you're working on, going through every aspect of your work, your project, how does project A impact men and women differently? And are we actually putting the structures in place to ensure that the outcomes are equal, right? So it's really looking at everything you're doing and looking at how they affect men and women differently. So if I talked about a woman's political agenda, like just taking a U.S. example, social safety nets, right? We hear a lot, in our political campaigns about getting rid of entitlements. But if you look at that, women are disproportionately impoverished in the U.S. Women are the poorest of the poor, right? And then women of color, right, are the poorest of the poorest, right? If you're talking about just getting rid of social safety nets or entitlements, on the surface, it could say, well, that's a very gender-neutral initiative. But then when you're looking at that, women are, 2/3 as likely to be, receiving those social safety nets or dependent on those social safety nets, then the outcome is certainly not gender-neutral. So gender mainstreaming means you're actually looking at everything from the perspective of how does this affect women and men differently. And then I would even take it to the next step level and different social groups within women and men, right? Women of color, this certain ethnic group, this regional area, this geographic area, how then are they disproportionately affected? Yeah. And we're at 1. So is there any last burning question? Thank you so much. It was really great to be here. Thank you.